Everything was proceeding exactly as anticipated at the Supreme Court confirmation hearing until Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett posed a single question that caused Judge Amy Coney Barrett to visibly freeze. What unfolded next left everyone in the chamber stunned and might permanently transform how judicial nominees engage with Congress. That morning in room 216 of Washington, D.C.'s Hart Senate office building, nobody expected anything out of the ordinary. The familiar tension of high-profile confirmation proceedings filled the hearing room. The senators were arranged in their semicircle on the dais, cameras strategically positioned throughout, and journalists leaning eagerly forward in their seats. At the witness table sat Judge Amy Coney Barrett, composure intact, wearing an impeccably tailored black suit, her expression controlled and confident, just as it had remained throughout previous questioning days. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, specially invited as a questioner by the Senate Judiciary Committee, entered quietly carrying only a thin manila folder. Unlike other committee members surrounded by assistants whispering in their ears and stacks of binders, Crockett's preparation appeared almost minimalist. When her turn arrived, Crockett approached the microphone with calm demeanor. "Judge Barrett, I have just one line of questioning today," she began, her voice measured and clear. Barrett offered a slight nod, with the faintest hint of a smile suggesting she was ready for any routine questions. After all, she had skillfully navigated 3 days of intense questioning with precision and restraint, establishing herself as unflappable. But when Crockett opened that folder and read 7 words nobody in the room anticipated, Barrett's composure visibly cracked. The judge's hand, reaching for her water glass, froze mid-air. For a moment, complete silence fell over the hearing room. If you're seeing this unfold for the first time, be sure to like and subscribe as we analyze exactly how Jasmine Crockett managed to shake the unshakable Judge Barrett and transform the entire confirmation dynamic in under 5 minutes. For days, Judge Amy Coney Barrett had commanded the confirmation hearings with remarkable poise. A former Notre Dame Law School professor and judge on the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals, Barrett had established a reputation for sharp legal analysis and unwavering composure. Throughout the hearings, she had expertly deflected challenging questions about her judicial philosophy, previous rulings, and personal views on controversial issues. Most observers agreed Barrett was heading smoothly toward confirmation. Major networks commented on her masterclass in judicial restraint and unflappable demeanor. Legal analysts marveled at how she could respond to hours of questioning without notes, citing case law from memory with precision that impressed even her critics. But Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett noticed something others missed. A former trial attorney, before entering politics, Crockett had spent years studying witnesses, detecting subtle tells indicating when someone was carefully navigating around the truth rather than addressing it directly. While others focused on Barrett's composure, Crockett had been analyzing response patterns, identifying specific topics where the judge became slightly more guarded, where her carefully constructed answers followed particular linguistic structures designed to create an impression of transparency while revealing nothing substantive. As Barrett sat at the witness table, she represented not just herself, but a pivotal judiciary shift that would influence American law for decades. She had every reason to feel confident. Previous questioning had followed predictable paths, allowing her to respond with practiced non-answers that satisfied procedural requirements without creating vulnerability. Crockett, meanwhile, was viewed by many committee members as a junior addition, passionate but inexperienced in Supreme Court confirmation traditions. Some senior senators had privately expressed concerns that her questioning might be too aggressive, potentially generating sympathy for Barrett rather than substantive insights. What no one realized was that Crockett had spent previous nights developing a completely different approach to questioning Barrett, one based not on ideology or philosophy, but on specific inconsistencies in Barrett's judicial record that had gone unnoticed by others. Judge Barrett, Crockett began, you've repeatedly stated during these hearings that you approach each case without predetermined outcomes, that you follow the law where it leads regardless of personal preference. Is that an accurate characterization of your testimony? Barrett nodded confidently. Yes, Congresswoman, I believe a judge must set aside personal views and apply the law as written. Crockett maintained direct eye contact. And you've also stated that your judicial philosophy would not be influenced by any private affiliations or personal beliefs, correct? That's correct, Barrett replied, her tone suggesting this was familiar, comfortable territory. Crockett nodded, opening her folder deliberately. Then I'd like to discuss a specific case that appears to contradict those assertions. The room's atmosphere shifted subtly. Barrett's expression remained neutral, but those watching closely noticed her posture straighten slightly, the instinctive preparation for potential challenge. What I have here, Crockett continued, is something none of my colleagues have addressed yet, but which directly relates to your ability to separate personal conviction from judicial responsibility. The stakes couldn't have been clearer. This wasn't just about one nomination anymore. It was about whether the public deserved to know if a lifetime appointee to the highest court could truly set aside personal beliefs when they conflicted with constitutional principles. Judge Barrett, Crockett began, her voice clear in the now silent hearing room, I'd like to direct your attention to your ruling in the case of Williams versus Cook County Department of Corrections from 2019. Barrett nodded slightly, recognition flickering in her eyes. It was a relatively minor case that had received little attention during the confirmation process, a detail that suddenly seemed significant given Crockett's focus. You wrote the majority opinion in that case, affirming qualified immunity for corrections officers, despite evidence of deliberate indifference to a prisoner's medical needs, correct? Yes, Congresswoman, Barrett replied evenly. The case turned on whether the established precedent was sufficiently clear to overcome qualified immunity protection. Crockett nodded, turning a page in her folder, and 6 months prior to that ruling, you gave a speech at the Federalist Society where you specifically criticized the expanding application of deliberate indifference standards in prisoner rights cases, calling it, and I'm quoting directly, judicial overreach that undermines necessary discretion for corrections officials. A subtle shift occurred in Barrett's expression. Nothing dramatic, but a tightening around the eyes suggested surprise at the connection Crockett was drawing. Speeches and academic discussions are distinct from judicial rulings, Congresswoman, Barrett responded, her voice still measured but with a new edge of caution. My ruling was based on precedent and the specific facts of that case. I understand the distinction, Crockett replied, but I'm concerned with the timing and the content alignment. She pulled out another document. 3 weeks before Williams came before your court, you attended a private conference on prison reform where you participated in a panel titled Restoring Balance to Prisoner Litigation. The attendee list included representatives from the same corrections department involved in the Williams case. Murmurs spread through the hearing room. A senator leaned over to whisper to his colleague. Barrett's attorney, seated behind her, straightened in his chair. I attend many legal conferences, Congresswoman, Barrett said, a hint of defensiveness entering her voice, and I recuse myself from cases where actual conflicts exist. Did you disclose this particular conference participation before hearing the Williams case? Crockett asked directly. A moment of silence followed. The C-SPAN camera zoomed in slightly on Barrett's face, capturing the careful calculation behind her eyes. I don't believe that conference created a conflict requiring disclosure, Barrett finally answered. Crockett didn't react visibly, but her next question came with precision timing. Are you aware that the organizing documents for that conference explicitly stated its purpose was to develop strategies to limit the expansion of prisoner rights litigation? Barrett's right hand moved slightly toward her water glass, but stopped midway. I don't recall the specific language in the invitation materials. Let me refresh your memory, Crockett said, and nodded to an aide who displayed a document on the large screen visible to the entire room. There, highlighted in yellow, was the exact language Crockett had quoted, along with Barrett's name listed as a strategic advisor to the conference planning committee. The committee chairman shifted uncomfortably. Congresswoman Crockett, we should be focusing on the nominee's judicial record, not conference attendance. Crockett nodded respectfully to the chairman. With all due respect, Mr. Chairman, I am addressing the judicial record directly. The Williams ruling came just 3 weeks after this conference, and Judge Barrett's opinion used reasoning that mirrors the conference materials almost verbatim in sections. She turned back to Barrett. Judge, you've testified repeatedly that your personal views don't influence your judicial decisions. Yet here we have a case where you participated in strategy discussions about limiting certain types of litigation, then ruled on exactly such a case without disclosure, using reasoning that echoed the conference materials. How do you reconcile that with your testimony about impartiality? Barrett's composure, maintained effortlessly through days of questioning, visibly faltered. Congresswoman, you're drawing connections that don't acknowledge the legal reasoning that led to my decision in Williams. I'd like to explore that legal reasoning, Crockett replied, turning another page in her folder. Because in 3 previous cases with nearly identical fact patterns, you reached the opposite conclusion when the defendants were not corrections officers. In Rodriguez v. Chicago Memorial Hospital, you specifically wrote that medical staff showed deliberate indifference that clearly violated established rights. Barrett's eyes narrowed slightly. This wasn't the typical ideological questioning she had prepared for. This was methodical, evidence-based examination of consistency, or lack thereof, in her judicial approach. Those cases had distinguishing factors, Congresswoman, Barrett began, but Crockett gently interrupted. I have the full text of all 4 rulings here, she said, and I've highlighted the fact patterns in each. Would you like to point to the specific distinguishing factors? Because independent legal scholars from across the political spectrum have noted that the facts were remarkably similar, with the primary difference being the institutional context. The room had grown increasingly tense. Senators who had been checking phones or whispering to aides were now fully attentive. Barrett's supporters on the committee looked concerned, while others leaned forward with renewed interest. Judge Barrett, Crockett continued when no immediate response came. I want to be absolutely clear. I'm not questioning your qualifications. I'm asking about consistency and transparency. The American people deserve to know if external influences, whether personal belief or institutional pressure, affect your judicial decision-making, particularly when you haven't disclosed relevant connections. Barrett's expression hardened slightly. For the first time in the hearings, she appeared not just careful, but defensive. Congresswoman, I believe you're mischaracterizing both my record and the significance of conference participation that is common among federal judges. If you're suggesting impropriety— I'm not suggesting anything, Crockett interjected calmly. I'm presenting documented facts and asking how they align with your testimony about judicial independence. These aren't abstract questions about philosophy. These are specific instances where your actions appear inconsistent with your stated approach. The committee chairman tapped his gavel. The Congresswoman's time is nearly expired. Crockett nodded. Just one final question, then. She looked directly at Barrett. Given what we've discussed, would you be willing to commit to disclosing any similar conference participations or strategy sessions should cases related to those topics come before you on the Supreme Court? It was a question that demanded either a commitment to greater transparency or an explicit refusal. Neither option comfortable for Barrett in that moment. Barrett glanced briefly toward her counsel, then back at Crockett. Congressional oversight does not extend to dictating judicial disclosure practices beyond what's already established in law, she said, her tone taking on a distinct chill. "I think you're overstepping, Congresswoman." It was the first direct pushback Barrett had offered any questioner, a departure from her practiced patience throughout the hearings. The shift was subtle but unmistakable, an attempt to intimidate through institutional authority rather than address the substance of the question. The committee chairman leaned forward. "The nominee is right to clarify the boundaries of this questioning." But Crockett remained unruffled. "With respect, Mr. Chairman, I haven't asked Judge Barrett to commit to anything beyond what judicial ethics already require. I've simply asked whether she will commit to transparently disclose potential conflicts. It's a yes or no question." She turned back to Barrett. "Judge, your response suggests you view basic transparency as congressional overreach. That perspective itself seems relevant to these proceedings." Barrett's eyes flashed briefly. "Congresswoman, I've maintained the highest ethical standards throughout my career. Your implication otherwise is inappropriate." It was exactly the response Crockett had anticipated. With methodical calm, she reached into her folder one final time. "I'm not making implications, Judge Barrett. I'm providing evidence," she said, and held up a document. "This is a letter signed by you and 14 other judges to the Judicial Conference 3 years ago, actively opposing expanded disclosure requirements for conference participation and advocacy group connections." Crockett handed copies to committee members. "In this letter, you specifically argued that judges should maintain discretion to determine when affiliations might constitute conflicts. You wrote that mandated disclosures would chill judicial participation in important legal discourse." The room fell completely silent as committee members reviewed the document. "My question isn't hypothetical," Crockett continued. "You have actively advocated against the very transparency I'm asking about. The American people deserve to know that." Barrett's attempt to intimidate through institutional authority had backfired completely. Instead of Crockett appearing to overstep, Barrett now seemed to be hiding behind procedural shields to avoid accountability. "The American people also deserve a confirmation process that respects the separation of powers," Barrett countered. But her response sounded increasingly defensive rather than authoritative. "The separation of powers depends on checks and balances," Crockett replied evenly. "Congressional advice and consent isn't meaningful if nominees conceal relevant information." She addressed the full committee. "Now, colleagues, this isn't about politics or judicial philosophy. Justice requires not just legal expertise, but a commitment to impartiality and transparency. Judge Barrett's rulings show pattern discrepancies that correlate with undisclosed affiliations. Her resistance to basic disclosure should concern all of us, regardless of political affiliation." The chairman, recognizing the shifting dynamics, tried to regain control. "The Congresswoman's time has expired." "I yield back," Crockett said, but the damage was done. Barrett, who had maintained perfect composure through days of questioning about abortion, health care, and presidential power, sat visibly unsettled. Her strategy of projecting calm authority had collapsed when faced not with ideological challenges, but with specific documentation of inconsistency. In the press section, reporters were already filing updates. Barrett, defensive when questioned about undisclosed conflicts, read one headline taking shape on a journalist's laptop. As Crockett returned to her seat, several senators from both parties could be seen flipping through the documents she had distributed, whispering among themselves. The chairman called a 15-minute recess, an unscheduled break that itself spoke volumes. In that moment, the dynamic of the entire hearing had shifted. Barrett, previously sailing toward confirmation with mechanical precision, suddenly appeared vulnerable, not because of her judicial philosophy, but because someone had finally pierced the carefully constructed image of unimpeachable neutrality. When the hearing resumed, Barrett returned with renewed composure, but something fundamental had changed. Her answers became more specific, less veiled in generalities. Several senators, clearly influenced by Crockett's approach, began asking for more concrete commitments regarding disclosure and recusal standards. By session's end, Barrett had made an unprecedented commitment to review and strengthen her disclosure practices regarding conference participation and speaking engagements, a concession that would never have emerged without Crockett's methodical exposure. In just 5 minutes of questioning, Jasmine Crockett had accomplished what days of standard interrogation could not. She had moved beyond the rehearsed scripts and ideological theater to reveal something authentic about how Barrett approached her judicial responsibilities. She had made the nominee regret attempting to intimidate rather than engage, and in doing so had changed what the public would demand from future nominees. Within an hour of the exchange, video clips spread across every major social media platform. Crockett questions and Barrett disclosure became the top trending hashtags nationwide. The 5-minute segment was being dissected on legal blogs, analyzed in law school classrooms, and replayed on news networks with panels of experts weighing in on its significance. CNN ran with Crockett confronts Barrett on undisclosed conflicts. Fox News framed it as Barrett commits to review disclosure practices after tough questioning. MSNBC's headline read, Crockett exposes pattern of inconsistency in Barrett rulings. What made the exchange so compelling wasn't partisan framing. It was the substantive nature of the challenge and Barrett's visible discomfort when confronted with documented inconsistencies rather than hypothetical scenarios. The Senate cloakroom buzzed with conversation as members from both parties discussed what they had witnessed. She came with receipts, one senior Republican senator was overheard saying to a colleague, not political talking points, actual evidence. A Democratic senator who had spent his 30 minutes questioning Barrett about hypothetical abortion cases ruefully admitted to his staff, Crockett did more in 5 minutes with specific case citations than the rest of us did with broad hypotheticals. Legal analysts across the political spectrum weighed in throughout the evening news cycle. On CNN, a conservative legal scholar acknowledged, what made Congresswoman Crockett's questioning so effective was that she avoided ideology entirely. She focused on process and consistency, values that should matter regardless of judicial philosophy. A liberal commentator on Fox News conceded, this wasn't a gotcha moment based on politics. These were legitimate questions about judicial consistency and disclosure that any nominee should be able to address. At the White House, advisors huddled to assess the damage. What had seemed like a smooth confirmation process suddenly faced a new complication, not enough to derail the nomination, but significant enough to require a response. After considerable debate, they arranged for Barrett to submit supplemental written responses addressing the specific cases Crockett had highlighted, attempting to explain the apparent inconsistencies. Meanwhile, in her congressional office, Crockett found herself suddenly in high demand. Interview requests poured in, senators from both parties requested meetings, and constitutional law professors reached out asking her to speak to their classes about effective oversight questioning. When asked by a reporter why her approach differed so markedly from her colleagues, Crockett's response was straightforward. I'm a former trial attorney. I don't ask questions unless I already know the answers and have documentation to back them up. This wasn't about scoring political points. It was about ensuring the public gets complete information about someone being granted tremendous power for life. The broader implications quickly became apparent across Washington. Other nominees scheduled for confirmation hearings suddenly requested additional preparation time. Committee staff began more thoroughly researching candidates' conference appearances and undisclosed affiliations. Law firms specializing in preparing nominees developed new protocols for addressing potential inconsistencies between public statements and judicial records. 3 days after the hearing, the Judicial Conference announced it would review its disclosure requirements for federal judges, specifically examining whether participation in issue-focused conferences should require more transparent reporting. While not directly citing the Barrett hearing, the timing left little doubt about what had prompted the review. Editorial boards across the country, from the Wall Street Journal to the Washington Post, published pieces about judicial transparency that transcended typical partisan divisions. A consensus emerged that while judges should maintain independence, basic disclosure of potential conflicts was a reasonable expectation that strengthened rather than undermined judicial legitimacy. In law schools nationwide, the exchange became required viewing in courses on congressional oversight, judicial ethics, and effective legal questioning. Professors noted how Crockett had demonstrated the difference between asking what someone thinks versus documenting what they've actually done, a fundamental distinction often lost in high-profile hearings that devolve into ideological performance. A week after the hearing, polling showed an interesting public response. While opinions on Barrett's nomination still largely followed partisan lines, there was near universal agreement, 87%, that Supreme Court nominees should disclose conference participation and advocacy connections when relevant to cases they've decided. The specific issue Crockett raised had resonated beyond partisan divides. Perhaps most significantly, Barrett herself appeared to take the concern seriously. In her supplemental written responses, she provided detailed explanations for the case discrepancies Crockett had identified while defending her ultimate rulings. She acknowledged that reasonable observers might question whether undisclosed affiliations influence decision-making, and committed to error on the side of disclosure and recusal in future cases where similar questions might arise. For Crockett, the impact extended beyond this single nomination. Her methodical, evidence-based approach had demonstrated that effective oversight required preparation and specificity, not just passionate rhetoric. Junior members of Congress from both parties began consulting with her about how to elevate their own questioning techniques. 6 months later, during another high-profile confirmation hearing, observers noted a distinct shift in questioning approaches across the committee. Fewer hypotheticals, more specific case citations, less ideological grandstanding, more documented pattern analysis. One senator explicitly referenced the Crockett method when pressing a nominee on consistency between public statements and private actions. A year after the hearing, Crockett contributed a chapter to a legal textbook on effective congressional oversight. In it, she emphasized that accountability transcends partisan politics. The most effective questioning isn't about attacking someone's values or beliefs. It's about testing whether their actions align with their stated principles. That alignment, or lack thereof, tells us far more about how someone will use power than any ideological label. The lasting legacy of that 5-minute exchange wasn't about liberal versus conservative judicial philosophy. It was about a fundamental reset in expectations for transparency and consistency from those seeking lifetime appointments to positions of enormous power and minimal accountability. As one legal commentator summarized, before Crockett questioned Barrett, judicial confirmation hearings were predictable theater where nominees refused to discuss specific issues while offering vague assurances about following the law. After Crockett, the standard changed. Nominees now know they need to explain actual ruling patterns and disclose relevant connections, because someone might actually check. So if this story made you think about accountability, transparency, and how preparation can transform oversight from theater into substance, subscribe to this channel. We'll continue analyzing the moments that matter, the confrontations that change institutional practices, and the voices that cut through rehearsed responses to reveal the truth about how power operates in America. Because as Jasmine Crockett demonstrated in those 5 minutes with Judge Barrett, asking the right questions with evidence to back them up can transform even the most controlled environments into moments of genuine accountability.